There are traits we are taught to reject, to suppress, to label as flaws. Society names them vices and urges us to cleanse ourselves of them. But there are certain inner tensions that appear again and again in the lives of those meant to walk a difficult path. These are not permissions to indulge in darkness, but burdens placed on those strong enough to transform them. God does not give these to everyone. They are entrusted only to souls capable of turning inner conflict into conscious strength. The first is restlessness. Chosen souls are rarely at peace with the surface of life. They feel an ache that has no clear name. This is not dissatisfaction born of greed, but a refusal to settle for false completion. Restlessness keeps them moving when others sleep inside routines. It breaks comfort so that growth becomes inevitable. Without it, awakening would never begin. The second is deep doubt. Faith that has never been questioned is fragile. Chosen souls wrestle with belief, meaning, and even God itself. Their doubt is not betrayal, it is initiation. Through questioning, they strip illusions away until only what is real remains. This inner conflict matures belief into something living rather than inherited. The third is intensity of emotion. They feel too much, too deeply, too painfully. Joy overwhelms, sorrow lingers, and love consumes. This emotional excess is often misunderstood as weakness. In truth, it is raw psychic energy. When integrated, it becomes compassion, creativity, and the ability to see what others cannot feel. The fourth is solitude. Chosen souls often walk alone, not because they reject others, but because their inner world demands silence. Solitude is not isolation, it is the furnace where identity is forged. In aloneness, they confront themselves without distraction, and through that confrontation, they become whole. The fifth is inner darkness. Every chosen soul carries shadow, impulses, fears, contradictions they wish they did not have. God does not remove this darkness, he allows it so consciousness can be born. Light that has never met darkness is naive. True wisdom emerges only when shadow is faced, understood, and integrated. These vices are not virtues in themselves, they are raw materials. If denied, they destroy. If embraced consciously, they transform the soul into something capable of guiding others. Chosen souls are not spared struggle. They are entrusted with it. And through that burden they become bridges between what is broken and what can be healed. Some traits labeled as vices are often misunderstood because they do not fit neatly into social ideals of control, balance, or comfort. From an external point of view, they appear disruptive, excessive, or flawed. Yet from a deeper perspective, these traits are not random defects of character but specific inner tensions placed within certain individuals for the sake of growth and transformation. They function less as moral failures and more as spiritual assignments, demanding awareness rather than suppression. What is condemned on the surface often hides a deeper purpose beneath it. A spiritual assignment is not given for ease, it is given for development. Traits that disturb inner peace force the individual into self-examination. They prevent the soul from falling asleep inside borrowed values or inherited identities. Where comfort would preserve the status quo, inner friction provokes movement. Restlessness, intensity, doubt, and contradiction disrupt automatic living and push consciousness forward. These qualities are burdens because they refuse to let the individual remain unconscious, and that refusal is precisely their value. When a trait is labeled a vice, the instinctive response is rejection. The person tries to eliminate it, hide it, or feel shame for possessing it. This reaction deepens inner division. The trait does not disappear, it goes underground, where it gains destructive power. What is denied becomes compulsive. What is condemned becomes unconscious. In this way, moral judgment without understanding turns a potential source of growth into a source of inner conflict. The failure is not the trait itself, but the refusal to engage with it consciously. Spiritual assignments demand responsibility, not indulgence. To say a trait has purpose does not mean it should be acted out blindly. Intensity without awareness becomes chaos. Doubt without reflection becomes cynicism. Solitude without integration becomes isolation. The task is not to express these forces impulsively, but to understand their origin and direction. When held in awareness, they transform into insight, resilience, and depth of character. Consciousness converts raw energy into meaning. These traits often appear early in life, long before the individual has language to understand them. The person senses they are different, more sensitive, more questioning, more inwardly complex. Because society rewards conformity and predictability, such traits are often corrected, medicated, or shamed. Yet correction does not resolve the inner tension. It only teaches the individual to mistrust themselves. The spiritual assignment remains, waiting to be acknowledged later in life, often through crisis. Growth begins when the individual stops asking, "How do I get rid of this?" and starts asking, "What is this asking of me?" This shift changes the relationship to the trait. The person becomes an observer rather than a victim. They learn to listen to what the tension reveals about unmet truths, denied emotions, or unlived potentials. In this way, the trait becomes a guide rather than an enemy. Ultimately, moral failure is passive. It avoids responsibility. A spiritual assignment is active. It demands engagement. Those given such inner challenges are not worse than others, nor better. They are simply tasked with carrying more psychic material into awareness. When they accept this responsibility, their so-called vices mature into discernment, empathy, and wisdom. What once felt like a flaw becomes the very structure through which meaning enters their life. Restlessness is often treated as a flaw, a sign that something is wrong with the person who cannot settle, commit, or remain satisfied with what is already present. From the outside, it appears as impatience or instability, but at a deeper level, it is an inner force that refuses stagnation. Restlessness is the quiet pressure that builds when the soul senses there is more to be lived, more to be understood, and more to be integrated. It disrupts comfort not to punish, but to awaken. Without restlessness, life easily becomes mechanical. Days repeat themselves, identities harden, and beliefs go unchallenged. The mind adapts to routines, and the spirit slowly falls asleep within them. Restlessness interrupts this sleep. It introduces dissatisfaction where complacency would otherwise settle in. This dissatisfaction is not rooted in ingratitude. It arises from an instinctive recognition that growth has paused. It signals that the current form of life can no longer contain the person's evolving inner reality. Awakening rarely begins in peace. It begins in friction. Restlessness creates that friction by exposing the gap between who a person has become internally and the life they are still living externally. This gap produces tension, and tension demands resolution. Some attempt to numb it through distraction, consumption, or constant movement, mistaking motion for progress. But restlessness cannot be silenced that way. It persists until its message is understood. This inner agitation often pushes individuals into periods of questioning. They begin to examine their beliefs, relationships, ambitions, and identities. What once felt sufficient now feels hollow. The restlessness is not trying to destroy these structures, it is testing them. Anything that lacks authenticity begins to feel heavy. Anything aligned with deeper truth gains clarity. In this way, restlessness functions as an internal compass, even though it rarely feels like guidance in the moment. Spiritual stagnation occurs when a person clings to certainty for the sake of comfort. Restlessness threatens certainty, and that is why it is feared. It dismantles rigid self-images and inherited narratives. It does not allow the individual to live on borrowed meaning. Instead, it insists on direct experience. Through this insistence, restlessness becomes the catalyst for inner work, self-confrontation, and conscious change. When resisted, restlessness turns destructive. It becomes anxiety without direction or dissatisfaction without insight. When listened to, it becomes movement with purpose. The individual learns to sit with the discomfort rather than escape it, to ask what truth is being avoided, what potential is being ignored, and what stage of life has been outgrown. The restlessness then softens, not because it has been suppressed, but because it has been honored. Those who experience deep restlessness are often called seekers, not because they are searching for something external, but because they are responding to an internal summons. The unease they feel is an invitation to expand consciousness. It is the force that prevents the soul from fossilizing inside outdated forms. Through restlessness, awakening remains possible, and spiritual life remains dynamic rather than static. Doubt is often portrayed as the enemy of faith, as though questioning were a sign of weakness or betrayal. From a deeper perspective, doubt is not the absence of belief, but the pressure that refines it. It arises when inherited answers no longer satisfy lived experience. Rather than destroying faith, doubt removes what is false, borrowed, or unexamined, leaving behind something more honest and resilient. What survives doubt is not belief by habit, but belief by realization. Faith that has never been questioned rests on authority rather than understanding. It is held together by repetition, social reinforcement, and fear of uncertainty. Such faith may provide comfort, but it remains fragile because it depends on external validation. When life presents contradiction, suffering, or injustice, unexamined belief collapses easily. Doubt enters at this moment not as an intruder, but as a necessary response to reality. It forces the individual to confront the limits of what they were taught. Inherited belief is often absorbed before the mind is capable of discernment. Family, culture, and tradition provide frameworks that shape identity long before personal experience can confirm or challenge them. Doubt awakens when the individual senses a gap between these frameworks and their own inner truth. This gap creates tension. The person must choose between clinging to certainty or risking the unknown. Doubt pushes them toward the risk, not to dismantle meaning, but to discover what is truly theirs. As doubt strips away illusion, it exposes belief systems that were maintained out of fear, conformity, or convenience. This process can feel destabilizing, even painful, because it removes psychological shelter. Yet this stripping is not destruction, it is purification. What falls away was never fully alive. What remains begins to breathe. Faith that emerges from this process is quieter, less performative, and less dependent on approval. It no longer needs to defend itself aggressively because it is rooted in lived insight. Doubt also cultivates humility. It dismantles the illusion of certainty and opens the individual to mystery. Rather than pretending to possess absolute answers, the doubting person learns to live with questions. This openness deepens faith by transforming it from rigid belief into trust. Trust does not require full comprehension, it requires honesty. Through doubt, faith matures from doctrine into relationship, from certainty into surrender. When resisted, doubt becomes corrosive. It hardens into cynicism or disengagement. When anger, consciously, it becomes transformative. The individual learns to examine beliefs rather than discard them impulsively. They differentiate between what was imposed and what resonates. This discernment strengthens faith because it is now chosen rather than inherited. Choice carries responsibility, and responsibility deepens commitment. The paradox of doubt is that it leads not to emptiness but to depth. By dismantling illusions, it clears space for something real to emerge. Faith refined by doubt is no longer fragile. It can withstand complexity, contradiction, and change. It does not demand certainty to exist. Instead, it draws strength from truth, however incomplete, and from the courage to continue seeking without clinging to false security. Emotional intensity is often misunderstood as excess, instability, or lack of control. Those who feel deeply are frequently told to soften, to be less reactive, to contain themselves for the comfort of others. Yet emotional intensity is not a flaw in emotional regulation, it is a heightened sensitivity to inner and outer reality. It allows experiences to penetrate more deeply, leaving lasting impressions that shape perception, meaning, and response. What appears overwhelming on the surface carries immense potential beneath it. Because intense emotion amplifies experience, it also sharpens empathy. A person who feels deeply recognizes emotional states in others without explanation. Suffering is not abstract to them, it resonates internally. Joy, grief, fear, and hope are not distant concepts but familiar landscapes. This familiarity creates compassion that is not performative but embodied. Empathy born from emotional intensity is not about fixing others, it is about understanding them without reducing their experience to simple narratives. This same intensity fuels creativity. Creative expression is often the transformation of emotional energy into form. Those who experience emotions vividly possess a rich inner world that seeks articulation. Music, writing, art, and vision become necessary outlets rather than hobbies. Creativity allows emotional intensity to move rather than stagnate. Without expression, this energy turns inward and becomes heaviness. Through creation, it becomes meaning. What cannot be said directly finds shape symbolically, allowing inner experience to be shared without being diluted. Emotional intensity also generates inner power when it is integrated consciously. Power does not come from suppressing feeling, but from learning to remain present within it. The capacity to stay with strong emotion without collapsing or acting impulsively builds resilience. Over time, the individual develops emotional endurance. They learn that intensity does not have to dictate behavior, it can inform awareness. This distinction transforms emotional force into psychological strength. Many people attempt to numb emotional intensity through distraction, substances, or emotional withdrawal. These strategies offer temporary relief but weaken inner vitality. Emotional intensity, when denied, does not disappear. It manifests as anxiety, exhaustion, or a sense of disconnection from life. When honored and understood, it becomes a source of depth. The individual learns to read their emotional responses as signals rather than threats. Feelings become information, not enemies. Intense emotion also deepens authenticity. Those who feel strongly are rarely able to live superficially. False interactions, shallow values, and empty pursuits feel intolerable. Emotional intensity demands truth because it reacts sharply to incongruence. This demand often leads to fewer but more meaningful relationships and commitments. The individual may appear selective or withdrawn, but in reality they are conserving emotional energy for what resonates. Inner power emerges when emotional intensity is aligned with consciousness. The individual no longer fears their depth, they trust it. They recognize that the IR sensitivity is not weakness but perception. Through this recognition, emotional intensity becomes a guiding force rather than a burden. It fuels empathy without self-loss, creativity without chaos, and strength without hardness. What once felt overwhelming becomes the very source of vitality and purpose. Solitude is often confused with loneliness, yet the two are fundamentally different. Loneliness is the pain of disconnection, while solitude is the space in which connection with the self becomes possible. In a world saturated with noise, opinions, and constant interaction, solitude appears uncomfortable, even threatening. This discomfort is precisely why it is essential. Solitude removes the mirrors provided by others and forces the individual to face who they are without reflection, validation, or distraction. When alone, the layers built for social survival begin to loosen. Roles, personas, and habitual responses lose their urgency. What remains is the raw presence of the self, including thoughts, emotions, memories, and impulses that are often suppressed during interaction. This encounter is not always pleasant. Solitude exposes contradictions, unresolved conflicts, and internal fragmentation. Yet without this exposure, integration cannot occur. What is never seen cannot be unified. Self-confrontation requires sustained attention, and solitude provides the conditions for it. In silence, patterns become visible. Repeated emotional reactions, recurring fears, and persistent desires rise into awareness. The individual begins to recognize how past experiences continue to shape present behavior. This recognition is the beginning of responsibility. Rather than projecting inner conflict onto the world, the person learns to hold it internally. Solitude thus shifts power from external circumstances to inner awareness. Integration is not about eliminating unwanted parts of the psyche, but about acknowledging and relating to them consciously. Solitude allows this relationship to develop. Inner voices that were once ignored or suppressed are given space to speak. Some express fear, others anger, others longing. Listening to these voices without judgment prevents them from acting out unconsciously. Through this listening, the fragmented self begins to organize into a coherent whole. Many resist solitude because it dismantles distraction. Without external stimulation, the mind initially amplifies discomfort. This phase often leads people to believe solitude is harmful. In reality, this amplification is temporary. It reveals what has been accumulating beneath the surface. If the individual remains present rather than escaping, the intensity gradually subsides, replaced by clarity. The mind settles and insight emerges naturally. Solitude also cultivates independence from external validation. When identity is shaped primarily through others, it remains unstable. Solitude strengthens inner authority by teaching the individual to orient themselves from within. Decisions become less reactive, values more authentic. The person no longer needs constant affirmation to feel real. This internal grounding improves relationships, as connection is chosen rather than used to fill emptiness. Inner integration achieved through solitude does not result in withdrawal from life but in deeper participation. Having faced themselves, the individual returns to the world with greater coherence. They respond rather than react. They engage without losing themselves. Solitude thus becomes a cycle rather than an escape, a necessary return to the inner ground from which meaningful action arises. Shadow and inner darkness are often treated as elements to be eliminated, feared, or morally condemned. People are taught to identify with what appears acceptable, bright, and controlled, while disowning impulses, emotions, and thoughts that contradict this image. Yet wisdom does not emerge from denial, it emerges from contact. Inner darkness is not the opposite of light. It is the soil from which conscious light grows. Without entering this inner territory, understanding remains shallow and incomplete. The shadow consists of everything the individual has learned to reject in order to belong, to be approved, or to feel safe. These rejected aspects do not disappear. They move into the unconscious, where they influence behavior indirectly. When unrecognized, the shadow expresses itself through projection, compulsion, and distorted judgment. A person becomes threatened by in others what they have not faced in themselves. In this way, avoidance of inner darkness creates outer conflict. True wisdom begins when the individual turns inward and acknowledges the presence of shadow without self-deception. This acknowledgement does not mean acting out destructive impulses, but recognizing their existence and psychological meaning. Anger, envy, fear, and desire carry information about unmet needs, violated boundaries, and unlived potential. When approached with awareness, these energies become intelligible rather than chaotic. Darkness begins to speak, and what it reveals is often uncomfortable but necessary. Conscious light differs from innocence. Innocence knows no darkness and therefore has no depth. Conscious light has passed through shadow and carries understanding. It is tempered by humility because it recognizes its own capacity for error. This is why wisdom often emerges from struggle rather than ease. The person who has confronted their darkness is less likely to judge blindly, manipulate unconsciously, or deny complexity. They have seen what they are capable of and learned to hold that knowledge responsibly. Avoiding shadow produces a false sense of goodness. Moral certainty becomes rigid, and compassion becomes conditional. The individual may appear virtuous, but this virtue is fragile. Under pressure, suppressed darkness erupts in uncontrolled ways. In contrast, those who have integrated shadow develop steadiness. They are not shocked by human contradiction because they have encountered it internally. This steadiness is a form of inner authority. The process of engaging shadow requires courage and patience. It dismantles idealized self-images and exposes vulnerability. Yet it also liberates trapped energy. What was once used to maintain denial becomes available for creativity, discernment, and strength. The individual no longer wastes energy fighting parts of themselves. This conservation of psychic energy deepens clarity and presence. Wisdom formed through shadow integration is not abstract. It manifests as discernment, empathy, and restraint. The individual understands the cost of unconsciousness and the value of awareness. Light becomes conscious because it is no longer naive. It illuminates without blinding and guides without dominating. Through inner darkness, the individual learns not only who they are, but how to live responsibly within the complexity of being human. So if you find within yourself restlessness that will not settle, doubt that refuses easy answers, emotions that run deeper than you can explain, a longing for solitude, and shadows you wish you did not carry, do not rush to condemn yourself. These are not signs of failure, they are signs of responsibility. You were not given an easy light, but a conscious one. Your task is not to escape your depth, but to enter it with honesty and courage. When you stop fighting what is within you and begin to understand it, darkness loses its power to control you and becomes the ground from which wisdom rises. Walk forward knowing that true light is not found by avoiding the night, but by learning how to see within it.